At Thanksgiving, my dad snapped, "You're just a burden, always have been." My sister laughed and said, "At least I make this family proud." I put down my fork, stood up, and left without a word. 3 weeks later, Dad called. "Why is the mortgage unpaid?" I just asked, "Ask your pride and joy." I, 32M, watched my father's face turn red as he leaned back in his chair, wine glass trembling in his hand. The Thanksgiving table had gone quiet, that suffocating kind of quiet where you can hear the gravy cooling in its boat. My mother stared at her plate. My brother pretended the mashed potatoes were the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. Then Dad said it. "You're just a burden. Always have been." The words hung there like smoke. I'd heard variations of this my entire life, but hearing it aloud at the dinner table, with everyone present, felt different. It felt final. I felt my chest tighten, my jaw clench, but I didn't respond. I couldn't. Because the moment his words finished landing, my sister laughed. That sharp, performative laugh she'd perfected over years of being the golden child. She leaned forward, her engagement ring catching the light, and told everyone that at least she made the family proud. Her fiancé nodded along, squeezing her hand. My mother flinched. Dad looked satisfied, like he'd won something. I set my fork down slowly. The metallic clink against the plate sounded loud in the silence. Everyone looked at me, waiting for an outburst, an argument, tears, the usual drama. But I didn't give them that. I just stood up, pushed my chair in, and walked out without saying a single word. No explanation. No goodbye. Just silence meeting their silence. That walk to my car felt like shedding a skin. The drive home took 20 minutes, and by the time I pulled into my apartment complex, the anger had crystallized into something colder and sharper. Rage is hot and messy. This was different. This was clarity. I sat on my couch for hours that night, scrolling through my phone, seeing the family group chat blow up with messages. My mother asking if I was okay. My brother sending a thumbs-up emoji, his way of saying he felt it too. And Dad, eventually, asking where I'd gone and whether I was coming back for dessert. Like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't spent the last 32 years making me feel like I was taking up space in a house that would have been better off without me. That's when I realized something. My father didn't actually care about me. He cared about the mortgage, the bills, the status of having a family. And my sister? She cared about winning. About being the one he bragged about at work. The one who'd never disappeared from the table without explanation. I'd been paying their mortgage for 8 months. It started about a year ago when my parents hit a rough patch financially. My father had been proud about it, too proud to admit he needed help, but my mother had broken down in front of me one Sunday, showing me the past due notices. I couldn't watch my mother suffer, so I started making the payments without telling Dad. I told my mother it was a temporary solution, that she needed to tell him. She kept saying she would, but she never did. Then the payments became monthly, a standing instruction to my bank account. I never expected gratitude. I never expected acknowledgement. But I also never expected to be called a burden at a family dinner in front of everyone I'm literally keeping afloat. That night, after Thanksgiving, I called my bank and canceled the standing order. Just like that. 8 months of payments, gone. The next payment would be due in 3 days, and it wouldn't be coming from my account. For the next 3 weeks, I didn't answer calls. I didn't check the family group chat. I turned my phone on Do Not Disturb and let myself exist in the quiet space I created. My mother texted individually, asking if we could talk. My brother sent memes, his way of checking in. My sister posted engagement photos on Instagram that got thousands of likes, and I watched them accumulate without responding. The silence felt like power. On day 21, my father called. Not a text, an actual call. I almost didn't answer, but something made me. He didn't greet me. He didn't ask how I was. His voice came through sharp and confused, asking why the mortgage payment hadn't gone through. He said the bank had called him asking about the missed payment, and he wanted to know what was going on. His tone suggested he thought there'd been an error, that maybe the automatic payment had glitched. I let the silence stretch for a moment before I responded, keeping my voice calm and level. I asked him a single question back. Why didn't he ask his pride and joy about it? The one who made the family proud? There was a pause on the other end. I could hear him breathing, processing. Then he started asking me what I meant, his voice shifting from confusion to the edge of anger. But I'd already said what I needed to say. I hung up before he could continue. The aftermath came fast. My mother called me 6 times that day. My brother texted asking what had happened. My father left a voicemail that started angry and ended with something that might have been desperation. He said we needed to talk, that this was serious, that he didn't understand why I would do this. Why I would do this. Like 8 months of keeping them afloat meant nothing. Like his words at Thanksgiving hadn't been calculated. Like he just slipped up. I took my time responding. I ignored the calls for 2 more days, letting the panic build on their end. I imagined my mother stress-eating in the kitchen. I imagined my father making calls to figure out his options. I imagined my sister finally realizing that the safety net her parents had relied on was gone, and it wasn't her problem to solve. On the 3rd day, I texted my mother, just her, not the family chain, and told her I was done. I explained that I'd been paying their mortgage for 8 months without acknowledgement or gratitude, and that I'd stopped. I told her the house payments were their responsibility now, not mine. I told her I loved her, but I couldn't set myself on fire to keep them warm. She called immediately, and I answered this time. Her voice was shaking as she asked me to explain what had happened. I told her everything. The months of payments, the Thanksgiving dinner, the way my father had spoken to me, the way my sister had laughed. I told her I wasn't angry anymore. I was just done. She cried. She apologized for not standing up for me. She said she'd always thought I knew how grateful she was, that she tried to tell my father he was being unfair. But sorry didn't change anything. Sorry didn't unpay the mortgage or undo the 8 months of silence when they'd had no problem taking my money. My father's response came through my brother 3 days later. Apparently, he'd been trying to figure out financing options, and it had become clear to him that he couldn't cover the payments on his own. My brother told me Dad wanted to meet in person, that he wanted to apologize, that he'd realized he'd been unfair. I didn't go. Instead, I sent him a message, the first communication I'd initiated since Thanksgiving. I told him that his apology meant nothing without change. I told him that money wasn't the issue, respect was. I told him I'd spent 32 years trying to earn his approval and his father's pride, and I was finally accepting that I never would. I told him I was going to help with the mortgage moving forward, but it would be because I choose to, not because I'm obligated, and it would be on my terms, not his. I also told him that if he ever spoke to me the way he had at Thanksgiving, our relationship was over. Not suspended. Over. The mortgage payments resume next month, but differently now. I set up direct payments to the bank, not through my parents. The house stays secure, but I'm no longer their silent savior. I'm just a son who's decided his own peace is worth more than their comfort. My sister hasn't mentioned any of this. She's been suspiciously quiet, which tells me enough. I imagine someone finally told her that I'm the reason the family hasn't lost the house, and that my father's pride and joy status isn't actually worth anything when it comes to real problems. As for Thanksgiving this year, I'm planning to spend it somewhere else, with people who don't make me feel like a burden for existing. Update 1. 2 weeks after my message, my father showed up at my apartment unannounced. I almost didn't answer the door, but something told me to see this through. He looked smaller than I remembered. His suit was wrinkled, and his face had that gray, exhausted look of someone who hasn't slept properly. He asked if we could talk, his voice stripped of the authority it usually carried. I let him in, but didn't offer him anything. No water, no coffee, no small gesture of welcome. He sat on my couch, and I stood across from him with my arms crossed. He started by telling me he'd been wrong. Not in a rehearsed way, but in the halting, uncomfortable way of someone who's never had to apologize for anything significant before. He said he'd spent years taking out his own failures on me, that he'd resented me for being the responsible one because it highlighted his own shortcomings. He admitted he'd been jealous, that while I was quietly handling things, my sister was out living her life, and he'd started favoring her because she made him feel young and successful by association. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I told him that understanding why he'd hurt me didn't erase the hurt. I said I wasn't interested in being the emotional support that made him feel better about his mistakes. I asked him what he expected from me now. He said he didn't know. He just knew he didn't want to lose me. I told him that losing me had already happened, years ago. What we were doing now was deciding whether anything could be rebuilt, and I wasn't sure it could be. I said I'd continue helping with the mortgage because I loved my mother and I wouldn't let her suffer, but he couldn't expect me to forget this or move past it quickly. I told him trust was something that had to be earned back, not given because he'd finally acknowledged the problem. He left an hour later. He didn't cry, but I could tell he wanted to. As he was leaving, he told me he was proud of me, for standing up for myself, for not letting him push me around anymore. It was the first time he'd ever said that, and it meant nothing and everything at the same time. My mother called that night. She told me my father had come home and told her everything. She said he'd been drinking in the garage for hours, not in a destructive way, but in the way someone does when they're sitting with the weight of their own failures. She thanked me for not backing down, for making him actually face what he'd done instead of just smoothing it over like we always did. She also told me something I didn't expect. She'd known about my mortgage payments the entire time. She'd found the bank statements 3 months in. She'd been terrified to tell me because she didn't want me to feel obligated, but she also didn't know how to stop the help without humiliating my father further. She'd been caught between her son and her husband, trying to protect both of us, and it had slowly eaten her alive. I asked her why she didn't just tell him. She said she'd tried, multiple times, but he'd always found a way to deny it or justify it or turn it around. So she'd let it continue, hoping he'd eventually realize on his own what I was doing and develop some sense of gratitude or awareness. He never did. I forgave her that night, not because she'd necessarily done the right thing, but because I understood she'd been trying to keep the peace in an impossible situation. I also set a boundary. Moving forward, she couldn't keep secrets from me about family finances. If something happened, I needed to know directly, not discover it later. Update 2. I ran into my sister at the grocery store about a month later. She was in the produce section, examining avocados with the kind of intense focus she usually reserved for social media. When she saw me, her first instinct was to ignore me, but her fiancé, who was standing next to her, nudged her and waved. I nodded and was about to move on when she suddenly approached me. She told me she needed to talk to me. Her tone wasn't apologetic, but it wasn't hostile either. It was something closer to resignation. We ended up at a coffee shop nearby, sitting in a corner booth that felt uncomfortably intimate given the distance between us. She started by asking if I was trying to punish the family or if I was actually done with them. I told her I wasn't punishing anyone. I was just protecting myself. She then said something that surprised me. She told me that after the mortgage situation exploded, Dad had tried to get her to help. He'd asked her if she could help with some of the payments, and she'd said no. She'd told him it wasn't her responsibility. I asked her why she was telling me this. She said because she realized, for the first time, that she'd never had to be responsible for anything because I'd always been there. She said that at Thanksgiving, when she'd made that comment about making the family proud, she'd meant it as a dig at me, something to make herself feel better about the fact that Dad always seemed disappointed in her too, just in different ways. But when Dad had actually needed her, when it came down to real consequences, she'd done nothing. And that made her feel like the actual burden. I didn't respond immediately. I let her sit with that feeling for a moment. Then I told her that I didn't blame her for being selfish. We're all selfish sometimes. What I blamed her for was laughing at me while Dad was hurting me. That was a choice. That was cruelty. She nodded, and I could tell she was crying a little, even though she was trying to hide it. She told me she was sorry. She said it in a way that sounded genuine, like she'd actually sat with the weight of it. She also told me that her relationship with Dad had changed since all of this, that she'd realized he'd put her on a pedestal that was starting to crack, and it was only a matter of time before she disappointed him too. She said she was actually grateful that I'd done what I did, because it forced everyone to stop pretending. Before we left the coffee shop, she asked if we could be close again. I told her that I didn't know, but I was willing to try if she was willing to actually show up as a sister instead of just a competitor. She agreed, and we exchanged phone numbers like we were starting over, which I guess we were. The following week, she called and asked me to grab lunch with her. Just the two of us, no fiancé, no performance. We talked about actual things, not surface-level stuff, but real things. She told me about her insecurities, about how Dad's approval had become like a drug she couldn't stop chasing. I told her about my resentment and how I'd been processing the anger in therapy. We didn't become best friends overnight, but we became something closer to genuine siblings, which was new territory for us. Update 3. 6 months after Thanksgiving, we had a family dinner again. Not at the house, at a restaurant that my mother chose, Neutral Ground. The decision had been mine to attend, and I'd spent 2 weeks debating whether it was worth it. In the end, I decided that avoiding the family forever was just another way of giving them power over my life. We sat around a table that wasn't the Thanksgiving table, and the dynamic was different. My father was quieter, more thoughtful. When he spoke, it it was with less certainty, less of that authoritative judgment. My mother was more present, less anxious. My sister actually engaged with me directly instead of through barbs and competition. And my brother, who'd stayed mostly quiet throughout all of this, seemed relieved that the tension had shifted into something more manageable. My father told me he'd been in therapy. He said he was working through some stuff with his own father, understanding where his need to diminish me had come from. He said he wanted to rebuild our relationship, but he understood it would take time. He also said something unexpected. He told my brother and sister that I'd been helping with the mortgage for months before everything exploded, and he wanted them to understand what kind of person I was. Not to make me look good, but to acknowledge the truth. My sister's fiancé looked shocked. My sister looked ashamed. My brother just nodded like he'd already known. I told my father I appreciated the therapy, and I meant it. I told him I wasn't ready to fully trust him again, but I was willing to try building something different, something based on honesty instead of performance and resentment. I said that moving forward, the mortgage payments would continue because I could afford them and my mother deserved security, but I needed him to understand that this wasn't an obligation he could take for granted. It was a choice I was making, and choices could be revoked. He nodded and told me he understood. After dinner, my mother walked me to my car. She told me how proud she was of me, not for helping with the mortgage, but for refusing to let the family dynamics destroy me. She said that my father had told her I'd been the adult in the room all along, and he was sorry it took a crisis for him to see it. She also told me something her therapist had said, that sometimes the most loving thing we can do for our family is to stop saving them. I hugged her and told her I loved her, and I meant it in a way I hadn't fully meant it before. The love was still there, but it was no longer suffocating. In the months that followed, things normalized in a different way. My father still had his moments of old patterns, occasionally slipping into judgment or criticism, but when he caught himself, he apologized. It was awkward and didn't feel natural to him, but he was trying. My sister and I developed an actual friendship, something separate from our shared family history. My mother seemed lighter, less burdened by the weight of keeping everyone happy. The mortgage payments continued, but on my terms. I set them up quarterly instead of monthly, just to make sure everyone understood this wasn't a passive arrangement. My father got a side job to help cover the rest, which seemed to give him some of his pride back. As for me, I stopped waiting for acknowledgement or gratitude. I stopped measuring my worth against my father's approval. I helped because I chose to, and that choice was enough. The revenge I'd sought, that cold, calculated withdrawal of support, had turned into something better. It had turned into freedom. Thanksgiving that year came and went. I went to my best friend's house instead of my family's. My mother understood. My father had asked if I would come, and when I said no, he didn't push. That felt like progress. Now, almost a year after the confrontation, things are still fragile but genuine. My father and I have actual conversations instead of performances. My mother is happier. My sister is more honest. And I'm no longer the silent savior carrying the family's weight on my shoulders. The mortgage still gets paid, but now it's a gift instead of an obligation. And that makes all the difference.